Hi, and welcome back to All Truth is God's Truth. If this is your first episode with us, you've really picked a doozy. Today we're going to be diving into a difficult topic. We're going to actually be looking closely at the scientific concepts undergirding the theory of evolution. In this episode, I actually reference a number of graphs and charts or animations that I produced to help explain some of those points, and you can find those on our brand new website at atigtpodcast.com. So feel free to head on over there where you can both listen to the episode and watch some of the graphics that go along with the lesson. And in the future, we'll continue to be uploading blog posts there about the cultural and historical background of the Bible or other questions of interest to any Christian who really wants to dig deep into the truth of God's Word. Thanks for joining us this week, and let's dive in. My goal today is effectively to present a summarized or brief, compact form of what I'm convinced after my research is probably the strongest case for evolution. That is that I'm not trying to argue you should all affirm evolution. I'm just trying to say, if you meet a scientist who absolutely is adamant, evolution happened, you have to accept it, what are they going to tell you? And I'm going to hopefully present it in a more friendly manner than some of those scientists might, so that hopefully you can engage with the ideas and the data. And the hope is that we can just calm ourselves down a bit and actually interact with the evidence and think about it thoughtfully, carefully, and then continue worshiping God as opposed to, having a crisis of faith or anything like that. So that's the objective. I know it's odd, but I think it's tempting as soon as evolution comes up to want to attack it. And we will kind of do that next week. Next week, I'm going to do the con case effectively and say, I think there are some real questions that are very valid that we should be free to raise. And so we'll look at those next week. But this week, I'll present effectively the pro case, if you will, looking at why is it that there are people who even bother claiming that this is the history of life on Earth. I think there is some evidence to deal with. So here we go. The first thing I wanted to dive into was, speaking of attacking evolution, I think it's relatively common, or at least it was for me growing up, to specifically attack Charles Darwin or just all evolutionary theorists, thinking that, they're out to get you. And some of them are, absolutely. Some of them are. They do not, they would think that a view of the history of life on Earth that includes anything supernatural is anathema to science and thus needs to be, rooted out of society or something like that. However, I don't think Charles Darwin, that wasn't exactly his objective. I don't think he was he definitely wasn't, it seems, an adamant atheist. I don't think he was trying to overturn the world, and which he did. I hadn't quite appreciated until I started digging into some of the history. Almost immediately, the whole world was set ablaze on this debate, scientifically and theologically. Theologians were encountering it and responding to it within the year that he published his Origin of Species. And I don't think that was exactly his intent. I think he wanted to present a strong case for an idea he had, and he did. But I don't think he was trying to tear down the church or, cause too many problems. Some of the evidence for that actually comes right out of the Origin of Species. Actually, a good amount of evidence comes right out of the Origin of Species. The very opening page of the very first edition contains this quote, "To conclude, therefore, let no man out of a weak conceit of sobriety or an ill-applied moderation." I love the way people wrote back in the 1800s, right? Actually, this is a quote from even longer before, but anyway, "Far o think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's Word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, but rather let men endeavor an endless progress or proficiency in both." And this was a quote from Francis Bacon, who many people attribute as kind of one of the founding fathers of the philosophy of science in its kind of modern incarnation. But he concludes that quote, and you'll notice, I think intentionally, he's trying to meld the two to some degree, to go, I'm looking at the book of God's works, I'm looking at nature, but I'm going to affirm in my opening quotes here that I select for this book that you shouldn't be afraid to study either of these books too rigorously. So I don't think Charles Darwin was quite as antagonistic as maybe sometimes he's believed to be. This quote then is actually one of the concluding sentences of the entire book. And there's two versions. I added in the second edition and beyond, he included the text in brackets there. So I'll read it and we'll read the bracketed text. But I think partly because he set the world ablaze, he added that bracket of by the Creator. So here we go. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Obviously, he's affirming his view that there's a natural process that's creating new species out of previously unexisting forms. But he's at least at the very tail end, when he's wrapping it all up philosophically, I think he's trying to acknowledge that God could be part of this. Yeah, whether it's because God started it off or God is superintending. If you actually dig into the nitty-gritty of Charles Darwin's personal theology, it gets weird and messy and hard. Like he had a very difficult life in many ways. His family suffered some tragic losses, and that was hard for him to grapple with. But at the very least, I think he's open to it. He's not an atheistic, antagonistic scientist. Similarly, if you read The Origin of Species, one of the most frequently cited scientists in The Origin of Species is someone named Asa Gray, who was a very devout Christian who lived in Boston. Actually, you can still go see where he lived in Cambridge. And Charles Darwin clearly respected Asa Gray, which, quick side note, I think if you're going to be a scientist or in anything in this world, I think Asa Gray is a wonderful role model because, sure, Charles Darwin wrote a book that kind of turned over the world in its thinking, but Asa Gray had the absolute admiration and respect of Charles Darwin. And yeah, if you're gonna be a Christian in any field, being excellent at it and having the admiration of your peers because you're doing a fantastic job is, I think, a really fantastic way that you can minister to those around you. And you see it in the way Charles Darwin writes about Asa Gray, that he does really respect him, even though he takes a much more hands-on view of how God is perhaps engaging with this. I'll say Asa Gray does seem to, as you'll see from this quote, affirm that, yeah, I think Darwin's probably onto something, but he's clearly on the question of where's God's role in this. Asa Gray affirms God's somehow intimately involved, even if Charles is right about some of the mechanisms at work. So, agreeing that the plants and animals were produced by omnipotent fiat does not exclude the idea of natural order and what we call secondary causes. The record of the fiat, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, etc., and let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, seems even to imply them. So in Asa Gray's view, writing around the same time as Charles Darwin, literally corresponding with Charles Darwin as Charles Darwin is writing The Origin of Species, his view is that apparently the text in saying, let the earth bring forth, is that there's maybe a hint there textually that it's not that God says, poof, and there were all the fish, and poof, and there were all the land animals, but more so that perhaps God is somehow bringing about out of the material that he previously created there in the form of the earth, living species. Anyway, so that's Asa Gray's view. Not everyone agrees with that, but at the very least, right, you can see that early on they're debating it, and early on there's some friendly back and forth. There are others who are less friendly. Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, which is a name if I've ever heard one. He was the president of Princeton Theological Seminary. If you have my hand out, you'll find a parenthesis there. It says, when it was still good. But anyway, unfortunately, most of the Ivy League divinity schools, they're very different than what they once were. They're not. You'll learn a lot if you go there, but it's very different from what it used to be. You wouldn't go there to become a pastor usually. You'd go there to become an academic. Anyway, B.B. Warfield, man, it is really hard to accuse B.B. Warfield of being anything other than orthodox. In fact, in the debate on inerrancy of the Bible, he is a very key data point because if you're not familiar, in the 1970s, there was a document written called the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, which is kind of this generation's modernized restatement of what do Christians mean when they say, yeah, we think the Bible is inerrant. And it gets into the specifics of like original authorship and that's the inerrant document. But yes, of course, scribes make scribal errors, but we don't think that impacts what we're trying to claim here. And genre matters and things like that. But there's a counterpoint there that goes, oh, so you guys just invented inerrancy in the 1970s. Christians didn't really believe that before. And one of the key data points, there's several others that go even further back in time, but one of the key data points is B.B. Warfield, because if you look at his writings, it's very clear that he's affirming the total inerrancy of the Bible, and he's arguing for it because there's an active debate going on in his day, much like there was in the 70s and there still is today. That's B.B. Warfield's perspective. He's absolutely on the inerrantist side of the Bible. Nonetheless, he seems to kind of vacillate on this evolution question. He says evolution can in no case be accepted as the formula of all that is. We must in any case rise above it to the higher formula of God. That is, you can't just be a naturalist in your thinking on how did life get to earth. If you really want to affirm the Bible has anything to say on the subject in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you have to say God's part of the picture somehow. So, who is more than evolution, who indeed works in evolution, but also out of it. We say this is true. In any case, we intend to leave the impression that we are by no means as sure as is Dr. Iverack, someone he's arguing with, of the reality of evolution in the wide range which he gives it. We would not willingly drag behind the evidence, indeed, nor would we willingly run ahead of it. I really appreciate those last few lines in particular. Like, keep right apace with the evidence, right? Like, sure, maybe there is some good evidence. We're going to look at some of it today. But running too far ahead of it might be a philosophical error as well. So anyway, as you can see, probably from the quote, it's kind of straddling the fence to some degree. He's maybe a bit open to it, also somewhat critical of it. I sympathize with that. Charles Hodge, another theologian, another president of Princeton Theological Seminary, but wrote the standard systematic theology that was used probably throughout the United States and much of Europe for about a generation or two. So we have thus arrived at the answer to our question, what is exactly Darwinism? It is atheism. This does not mean, as before said, that Mr. Darwin himself or all who adopt his views are atheists, but it means that his theory is atheistic, that the exclusion of design from nature is, as Dr. Gray, that's Dr. Asa Gray, says, tantamount to atheism. This is part of a longer essay in which he's arguing, again, with the ongoing debate of basically naturalism versus is God somehow involved. Dr. Asa Gray says God is at least somehow involved. But if you say, no, he's not, in fact, you can produce everything in the universe you've ever seen, and you can just delete God from the equation and nothing changes, well then yes, you're an atheist. Effectively, that's what he's arguing here. So, still attacking it as a philosophy in terms of does it explain everything that is and ever could be, but a little more on the fence in other ways as well, acknowledging you could hold to a more evolutionary view, but also be a Christian. Finally, Louis Berkhoff is not so friendly. He's on the final end of things here. Theistic evolution is really a child of embarrassment, which calls God in at periodic intervals to help nature over the chasms that yawn at her feet. It is neither a biblical doctrine of creation nor a consistent theory of evolution. So I got this one from Wayne Grudem's systematic theology textbook, because as we discussed last time we were able to meet, he's not a fan of theistic evolution. He thinks it's out of the purview of what the Bible permits. I, as you know, am not entirely convinced that's true, but he quotes Louis Berkhoff as agreeing with him, to say the least, right? And I think there's actually some truth to what Louis Berkhoff is saying, in that I think there can be a temptation philosophically to go, oh, well, I guess if I'm going to be a scientist, I have to affirm a naturalistic approach to evolution. But then I'm a Christian, so I gotta jam God in there mystically, and I don't know where he fits or what he does. And now I call myself a theistic evolutionary theorist. And I have a hunch that's effectively what's causing Louis Berkhoff to look at that. And that absolutely happens. I think I will hand out next week an annotated bibliography of all that I looked up and read this week. And there's a few researchers on there where I think that's effectively what they're doing. And so I agree with Berkhoff. There's critique to be had there as well. Okay, that being said, my point here was that there was and there still is debate and uncertainty in terms of theologians and their perspectives on all this, even scientists and their perspectives on all of this. But that the church hasn't always been entirely at war. I mean, it has been a hot topic debate, but there have been Christians who've landed on both sides for a long time on this issue, or struggled to grapple with it, understood that there may be some merit to some of the arguments. I think it's an error for us to just say every Christian has always been against this. It's also definitely an error to say it's never been a hot button issue until the 1970s when suddenly it became a hot button issue. No, it's been a hot button issue the whole time. I think that's just the data, the historical data. So
it's not a salvation issue.
It's also, I agree, I think it's important to remember, right? Jesus saves us regardless of how you understand Genesis 1 and 2. I think it's valuable to think about Genesis 1 and 2 carefully, but exactly. At the end of the day, Jesus dies on the cross. That pays for our sins. That's what we're all here for.
And I think there's always going to be tension, right? We are finite in time, finite in what we can actually investigate and understand personally ourselves. So we're going to have to investigate the body of evidence that's available to us. I think we discussed previously in fullness of time. Everything I think will converge. But just like I think the example that you had other times about the model of an expanding universe, right? It took 400 years to resolve, right? We're not going to live long enough to see all of these things resolved, but in the amount of time that we have, we can make certain sense of certain things.
Yeah. Excellent points. Thank you. I want to encourage more discussion, but I do have like 35 more slides. So there's a quick pause. All right.
Jordan, try to run these slides for you.
There we go, Chuck. Yeah, I like it. All right. Well, if you're following along in the outline, we are now at heading number 2. We've moved beyond the history of evolution and its social and theological acceptance. I make the claim that there is significant evidence that the Earth is very old. If the Earth is really 6,000 or 10,000 or even 20,000 years old, no, evolution has not occurred. And even the biologists would affirm that. Like, if you could demonstrate that's really how old the Earth is convincingly and persuade them that that's true, maybe they wouldn't just ditch evolution overnight. But I think they'd recognize they'd be compelled to, because that's just not enough time. What they're claiming needs to happen does take a long time. So inevitably, the age of the Earth and this evolution thing get tied up. So why do I think, though, that there is evidence that the Earth is very old? Well, there's a few things that come into play here. One is that, just to get our heads straight about fossils, which we'll talk about here in a bit, fossils are only found, generally speaking, only found in sedimentary rock. So there's 3 basic types of rock, right? Back in middle school geology. But there's sedimentary, igneous, right? So igneous comes out of a volcano. There's no fossils in that, right? That stuff's dead. And then metamorphic is basically rock that was on the surface at one point, so it used to be sedimentary. And then through various geological processes, we think, if the Earth is very old, got what's called subducted down under other layers of the Earth's crust, heated under that pressure and closer to the Earth's core. And then there's other forces that can cause it to rise back up to the surface, and other layers erode up over the top of it. And now it's re-exposed. You can go pick it up. And potentially there's some old, like, melted fossils, basically, in there. But that's the third type. And so it's kind of a weird in-between of igneous and sedimentary. But the sedimentary layers have a problem in that we don't have a really great way of dating those, getting a good date for sedimentary layers explicitly. So how do we actually come up with dates for any of this stuff, fossils, let alone for the Earth overall? Well, there's a few things you can do. One is you can start to develop a relative dating for sedimentary layers if you make some key assumptions. And these are roughly the key assumptions. Effectively, time 1 and time 2 here on the far left, we're just assuming layers deposit on top of each other. And that feels right. That seems right? If what we're talking about sedimentary layers is like an animal dies, and that's what's going to be your fossil, and you have some erosion, a stream maybe depositing sediment there, or you're near a mountain range and just rain gradually causes a valley to fill in with what's called alluvial plains or whatever, then those are your layers. And as time goes on, the top layers are going to be more recently deposited than the bottom layers. Originally, they're horizontal, right? Gravity makes them flat. They stack on top of each other. So that's their 2 assumptions. And then the third one is anything that kind of juts through those was probably done after the fact, because we think when they were deposited, they were probably smooth and flat. So if you find layers all tipped up like this, we think that's because, some like volcano or something's pushing things up and your layers are now tilted sideways. They probably weren't deposited that way. But nonetheless, that's important because now you're counting time this way as opposed to straight up and down. So that's part of it. Or if there's a fault and things start to shift with respect to each other, that was probably added afterwards. And so you can start to look at, these layers have different faults than these ones. So you can help form relative dating that way. There's another key thing is that some fossils show up in only a handful of layers. These are called index fossils. From a biology perspective, what the biologist thinks is happening is a species evolves and then not too long after goes extinct. That's very useful for your dating because that means if you find a layer that has that fossil, you can narrow it down to, whatever this species was alive, we think, that's what this layer corresponds to in terms of dating. And then finally, the igneous layers. That's the key for how you form your dating system. Because the igneous layers spit out lava or something hot and molten, and the minerals in there will crystallize as they cool. And we think, and these are the assumptions, but you can test these assumptions, this is a scientific claim, we think that there are certain elements, in particular uranium and lead, that undergo special chemistry in the crystals of those minerals as they cool. In particular, there's one crystal that's very commonly used for radiometric dating called zircon. And the claim is that as zircon cools, it kicks out lead. Kind of like if you freeze an ice cube and you pull water from the tap, you freeze an ice cube and you'll notice it's all cloudy. What's happening there is as the ice crystals form, it kicks out all of the oxygen and other gases, carbon dioxide. And now you have little air bubbles trapped inside your ice crystal. But if you just chip off pure ice, those crystal clear layers, you could look at that and go, okay, this is pure H2O. No, or at least there might be other things, other impurities in there, but that's roughly the example, is that as the crystal forms, it kicks out certain other things. We think lead is one of the things that gets kicked out of zircon as it cools and crystallizes. Which means if you find lead in zircon, it showed up after the crystal cooled and was held trapped in there, kind of like those air bubbles in your ice cube tray. So this gets down to radiometric dating. I give you a little table complete with half-lives of the different forms of radiometric dating that you might be able to do. In general, a radiometric dating technique is valid for, I'll just rough order of magnitude it, about 10 half-lives. So it's not too uncommon to hear people attack carbon dating. But in actuality, carbon dating doesn't get you very far, and it's completely useless for rocks. Carbon dating, if you're not aware, is only useful for dating things that used to breathe. You make some key assumptions there for that. I'll probably skip them for now. But basically, if you're exchanging carbon with the atmosphere, and you think you have a decent understanding of what sets the ratio of different types of carbon atoms in the atmosphere, then that's what you're relying on there. In the igneous rock, you're relying on the fact that crystal kicks out all the lead. So, for example, you can compare the ratio of how much uranium-235 and lead-207 occurs in a zircon crystal. And that ratio, in theory, if you're correct about the fact that all the lead got kicked out when this crystal formed, you look at how much lead is there, how much uranium-235 is there, and that should tell you how old that zircon crystal is. In other words, when did some volcano spit out this lava flow and it cooled?
So this is just to say how old a rock is.
This is just to say how old a rock is. But the idea is, if you've got some lava rocks here and some lava rocks here, you can bracket how old the fossils you find between those layers are. Okay. So it's a very complicated process to try to build up dating for specific fossils. But this is the process. So anyway, there's a handful of things to uranium-235. You can look at uranium-238, which goes through radioactive decay to become lead-206. That process has a half-life of 5 or 4.5-ish billion years. That's the age of the Earth, we think. And so if you find a rock with those minerals in it, you should be able to expect to find a relative amount of those two isotopes that's going to actually tell you something about the age of that rock. You don't think it will have all radioactively decayed into lead by that point. The way you do that is using something called a mass spectrometer. And the way these work is that these radioactive atoms, or elements like uranium, they have a very specific number of protons. That's what makes it uranium. But they have a different number of neutrons, going back to your high school physics or chemistry class about what's inside of an atom, right? So we got electrons, protons, neutrons. The way that a mass spectrometer works is because they have different number of neutrons, they have different amount of mass. And what you do in a mass spectrometer is you crunch up your zircon crystal, you vaporize it, and you rip off an electron by heating it up really hot. And the extra electron being ripped off means that all the atoms in your powderized, vaporized material you put in there now have an electric charge, which means they're going to interact with a magnetic field. So you shoot them down a gun in your mass spectrometer. So now they're cruising down your mass spectrometer, and you put them through a constant magnetic field, and things that are really heavy are hard to turn. And so they take a nice wide turn in your mass spectrometer. Things that are light are really easy to turn. And so as they go through that magnetic field, they get deflected off one direction and they take a sharper turn. And based on how fast they turn or don't turn, you get to actually measure something that looks like this figure here on the right, where you can say, oh, I found a whole bunch of stuff that has this much mass in it. Or really you're measuring the mass to charge ratio of that thing. And turns out that ionized uranium-235 and ionized lead-206 are very easily distinguishable, and pretty easily distinguishable from pretty much everything else too. Everything has a roughly unique mass to charge ratio within the context of a given crystal. So you measure its spectrum with something like that, and you go, aha, there's my lead-206 spike, there's my uranium spike. I measure that ratio, and if that rock is 4.4 billion years old, those two spikes should be about the same height. Now, that would be your test. From that, you have failed to disprove the hypothesis that that rock is 4.4 billion years old. In general, these heavier elements, they have too many neutrons to be stable, and that's what causes them to radioactively decay. So that uranium-235 means that if you add up all the protons and all the neutrons inside that particular uranium atom, there's 235 of them. And so it's atomic mass. And you work out the physics of what does that do? It kicks out some extra particles, it splits up in certain ways, and after some time, it decays into lead-207. And again, similarly with uranium-238 and lead-206. Or potassium-40 becomes argon-40. And you can work out the physics of how all these processes work, find where they're trapped in crystals, and try to back out the age of the Earth. So, to put this scientifically in testable if-then statements, if zircon crystals are formed in a lab today, then they will contain no lead. That is the hypothesis. Then you go to your lab and you make zircon crystals, and you try to see, can I get any lead into this zircon crystal, or does it kick it all out? I actually don't know the result of those studies. But boy, howdy, should scientists do that, right? If that's one of the assumptions of radiometric dating, then they need to test that assumption. So that would be an experiment. If I had more time, maybe I could have dug into those experiments. But absolutely, it's a valid scientific question that should be thoroughly tested. Or another one. So you found a rock. Okay, you're dating fossils. You found a rock. And you say, if this igneous rock cooled 4.4 billion years ago, then the uranium-238 to the lead-206 ratio in the zircon crystals of that rock will be approximately 1-to-1. Okay, because there is a number of different radiometric techniques you can use, you end up converging on answers using these different techniques, and the answers seem to suggest yes. Many of these rocks that we can dig up are in fact about 4.5 billion years old, so we think that's roughly the age of the Earth. Now, good scientific practice would be to continually subject these to careful scrutiny. These techniques these assumptions. I think, unfortunately, because of the cultural debate that's gone on this topic, the scientific community is often overprotective of these techniques because they assume that any criticisms are part of this faith versus science debate. So they're quick to kind of squash it and go, no, our techniques are good, are valid, when maybe there's some legitimate questions like, does your zircon really kick out lead-206 as much as you think it does? Are there other ways for lead-206 to end up in your sample? And in fact, heads up, there are other ways for lead-206 to end up in your sample, and you got to treat those really carefully. We don't have time to get into all of that, but it's a real concern. So I think good technique would be to carefully scrutinize these continually. My caution from us as a Christian community at large would be, if you're going to critique these techniques, I would say do it rigorously and scientifically, rather than just throwing out I think maybe it could be this, maybe it could be that. Those are great starting points. But I think if we're going to really present a critique, it should be, here's, I think, what might be happening here. Here's how I think that lead might be getting into the sample. Have we tested for that? Have we considered if that's a possibility? Because then you're offering real, scientific progress on, now we have a better understanding of how lead's getting into our zircon samples. Maybe that significantly changes the debate on all of these topics. But rather than just throwing out kind of darts at a wall, I think it's better to present a rigorous critique. Okay, apologies for the kind of meandering way of getting there. But that's the evidence for the age of the Earth in general. There's astronomical evidence as well. Again, we can talk more about it if anyone ever wants to talk about it. I think radiometric dating is probably pretty good. But I am very okay with questioning the rigor of the technique. I think that's always a good thing. And I am concerned that the scientific community is overprotective, is I think the right way to put it. So next week I'll talk more about that with regard to certain issues with the evolution debate at large.
Does plate tectonics and the theory of plate tectonics work in there? I mean, does that all seem to meld together? It's like there's the Atlantic rise and polarization of the things and stuff.
Yes. So yes, there are other lines of evidence. Absolutely, there are other lines of evidence. This is usually considered kind of the backbone of the evidence line. But yes, actually, so for example, the Earth's magnetic field, it seems, flips every once in a while. What we call the North Pole now was once the South Pole and vice versa. And as these igneous layers cool, the iron deposits in them align with the Earth's magnetic field. When it's hot, they can kind of float around. So they line up with the Earth's magnetic field, and then they cool and get locked in. So when you look at these igneous layers, you'll notice the iron deposits flip direction over many layers. And that is another technique for actually producing a relative dating, because, looking at it and going, it's pointed what we call north, this layer. It doesn't tell you anything about its dating, but you can kind of create a profile in a certain region and a similar profile, and the profiles seem to match up, but that lets you then cross-correlate. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the bottom 2/3 of what we see over here in this territory, and that, again, helps kind of cross-correlate the relative dating process for your fossils and things like that. But getting to an absolute dating, you need some means of saying this crystal cooled or something like that, and yay much time has passed since then. Okay, what does evolution claim? So another issue I think in this is that it is not too uncommon to run into a misunderstanding of, I think, the core concepts at the center of evolutionary theory. In particular, and Wayne Grudem is perfectly right, I think, in raising this concern, but the word random shows up a lot in evolutionary theory, and that was Wayne Grudem's key issue with theistic evolution, is that still relying on a random process. Genesis 1 and 2 seems to describe a intentional process. However, what's meant by random is a little different, I think, than what many people imagine. I think many people imagine, there's a statistics kind of hyperbolic argument that's used. It's a very valid point to make, I think, in the right context. But they'll say basically it's as though a tornado whirled through a factory and then threw together all the pieces to make a Boeing 737. That's how complicated the evolution, or an organism is, and so random processes aren't just going to spit out a Boeing 737. Similarly, random processes aren't going to just spit out a human body or even just a single-celled organism, And I agree, that is correct. Random processes alone won't just do that. Or rather, randomly throwing chemicals at each other won't just do that. But what's meant by random is a little bit different. I think I'll start with this analogy in that all the air molecules in this room are randomly moving. In fact, they're like the best example of randomness we have in the universe, is like air molecules bouncing off each other, or any kind of thermal process like that. However, if I take a bunch of air molecules over here and I apply a bunch of pressure to them somehow, whether I heat them up or I add more air and squeeze it all into this tight space, and I don't do that over here, I have equations that'll tell me, well, air is going to flow on average from that high pressure region towards that low pressure region. The thing that's doing that is just random bounces, right? Like it's just air molecules randomly bouncing off of each other. But the statistics work out such that there's an aggregate flow from high pressure to low pressure. That is closer to what evolutionary theory claims. That there are a lot of random processes, but that what Charles Darwin was trying to outline is that those random processes experience natural pressures for species to change over time. And with enough change, you call one species now a new species, was his argument. So, I have for us two random distributions, random things here on the screen. This is meant to be an illustration of one generation of a predator versus a prey relationship. So on the x-axis, I'm showing you how fast a thing is. And on the y-axis, using a log scale, I'm showing you how many of a species there are with that speed. So in the blue, I have the prey. In the red, I have the predators. You could substitute a gazelle and a lion or something like that. And so there's a whole bunch of gazelles, and they run at speed 30 numbers, right? 30 meters per second. That's a really fast gazelle. But some amount of speed here. Yeah, they run at 30. They run at 30, exactly. The lions, on the other hand, aren't quite as fast as the gazelles on average. They're a little bit slower. But in any given generation, some of the lions will be a little bit faster. Some of them will be a little bit slower. Some of the gazelles will be a little bit faster. Some of the gazelles will be a little bit slower. And this lion right here, a lion with that speed, can eat gazelles anywhere in this part of the graph on the left here. Those gazelles are too slow. That lion can catch it. These ones are pretty safe. There's no lions that can catch them. Maybe there's other things that'll eat them that are faster, but none of these particular lions can catch those particular gazelles. Okay, those are the natural forces. So, what happens? As you let time run on and the lions go on their hunt, the lions start to kill off all of the slower gazelles. And those slower gazelles, as they die off, mean that the slow lions also start to run out of food. And now, after a year of hunting, let's say, this is how the predator-prey relationship evolves. And what you can see is that the fast lions, on average, survive, and the fast gazelles, on average, survive. Then those gazelles make more gazelles, and the lions make more lions. And over many generations, in theory, this is what happens. You get both distributions going faster and faster. This is not evolution. This, or at least, I guess you could call it evolution, but this is not what Charles Darwin was claiming. This is not what an evolutionary theorist claims. This just makes faster lions and faster gazelles. It does not make things that aren't gazelles and things that aren't lions. To do that, you need to do something else. You need to add a second dimension. All right, now we're doing two-dimensional histograms. Are we ready? All right. But here I've said, okay, so, any given species, speed is going to matter. Is it fast enough? But in the competition for survival on a different axis, I've labeled camouflage. The prey might try to hide, right? Maybe they're hard to find, and that's why they survive. Or what I've called visual acuity. Maybe we'll change it to zebras, right? Zebras are trying to hide into the Serengeti grasses or whatever, and the lions, or get confused or something like that. And And the lions need good eyesight to be able to track their prey as they hunt them. So the lions with better visual acuity will be able to catch more of their food, and the gazelles, or the prey that are better at hiding, will also be able to hide from their hunters better. So this predator can eat any of those prey. So if you let that generation go on a hunt, here's what happens. You carve out a portion of the of both populations as they starve or are eaten. And on average, you'll notice the prey are both, on average, the ones that survive are faster, or they can be slower if they're better at hiding. So now, in reality, right, there's many, many dozens of key factors that matter in terms of your ability to hunt or survive or not be hunted. But if you at least go to 2, you can see what happens. And that is that if you have different environments, say in Europe, where things are maybe densely forested, running may not be your friend. You're just going to run into a tree if you get going at 30 meters per second. And that's not going to help you survive. But maybe you're going to get really good at hiding in the shrubbery. And so those are the species that survive in Europe. Whereas the specimens really that survive in, say, Africa on an open plain, there's not as much to hide in there, but speed's going to matter a lot. So now you have what could have been a gazelle-like creature in 2 different geographical territories experiencing 2 different pressures for survival. One makes gazelles that go faster. One makes gazelles that hide better. And with enough time, the argument is, those will look different enough, you'll go, they're not really the same. They're maybe related, and that was the argument is, oh yes, they had a common ancestor, but they're now different species, because one has these weird stripings on it to not hide in, and one's just wicked fast, And that's the argument. Random processes, randomness here, but organized forces of nature, the natural selection process, that can cause things to go in different directions and create different types of animals. That's the argument. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk case, but that is, I think, a good thing to bear in mind when debating, because if you miss what is your debater talking about, I think you lose street cred. And as Christians, I want us to have as much street cred as we can. Like, no, we're thinking about this carefully. We really care about the truth. We really think God is part of our universe because we have thought carefully and understand the issues, not because we're ignorant. Anyway, and so to not be ignorant, this is roughly what's being argued for. Okay, I gave you a quick outline that goes over a bunch of that, basically, in Charles Darwin's his argument there in terms of what is the core argument for the origin of species. Another factor there is that you'll notice, I assumed many of the members of each of those generations are going to die. And Darwin begins his whole book with exactly that. In fact, there was a philosopher named Malthus that was really pointing that out. And in particular, he was pointing it out about humans because he didn't understand the Industrial Revolution, basically, and he thought, there's too many humans, we're all going to starve. And that was a thing that's gone around a whole bunch of times. But anyway, from those basic arguments and from the math that kind of undergirds those arguments, yeah, if every species reproduces as much as it can, there's so many of them that not all of them can survive. And that means that you're going to get a differentiation in the characteristics between those that do survive and those that don't. Or at least it seems like you'd likely get that. If you have really slow animals, on average, they're probably going to be hunted out more than the fast ones. All right, the big question is that process, though, enough to actually create new species from one species, to cause those 2 groups to diverge enough that you really do say, that used to be a gazelle, now it's a cheetah gazelle. And that used to be a gazelle, but now it's a muskrat gazelle or something. I don't know. It's not something that hides better. And that's not a slam dunk closed case, I don't think, in terms of that's definitely happened or not. Another note, though, that as Darwin was writing, he did not know about modern genetics. DNA as a thing, genetics in general as a thing, was just being worked out around the time he was writing. DNA wasn't really anywhere on the horizon yet, but even just the concept of hereditary features and how they're transmitted properly was just being worked out, ironically by Christians. Because of that, Darwin actually makes some key mistakes in his argument, actually. I think it's just valuable to be aware of them, but they don't, I think, make the whole theory come crumbling down. For example, he, in a few places, argues that attributes which are acquired throughout one's life might be transmitted. So if I work really hard, beef up really strong, maybe I will be able to transmit my strength to my offspring. Modern evolutionary theory, or neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, says no, the information that's transmitted is all in the DNA. And that has nothing to do with how much you worked out or didn't work out as a human being during your lifetime. So even if you become really strong, that doesn't get transmitted to the next generation. So that actually, like, DNA gives a mechanism by which some of this randomness and transmitting things to the next generation might take place, but also, interestingly, kind of presents some obstacles in terms of understanding some things, and it undermines some of the arguments that Darwin made. With that, then, there is an opportunity for a few minutes of discussion if did people want to harass me. I know I just threw so much at you really quickly.
I think it's really interesting because I read Mere Christianity a few weeks ago, and there's a whole chapter in Mere Christianity about this, about the kind of creative evolution topic. And one thing that C.S. Lewis points out is that there's two views to this, and one being do we exist for a purpose and a reason, or do we not exist for a purpose and a reason?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say, when we have these types of conversations, that we should be well-versed. And in Bible study, one of the verses that we're going over Peter right now, and it says, be ready to always give an answer.
Yeah.
And I think we can back up our stance with the Bible and with science, right? And I think it's important, when we come around to the end of conversation, whether you're arguing with someone who's evolutionist or you're on the creationist view, it always should come back to God and why do we exist for a purpose, right? And we do, and just giving honor and glory to God. At the end, make sure that that's our stance, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, it is interesting that I think naturalism as a philosophy, which was a big part of the debate when Charles Darwin showed up on the scene with The Origin of Species. I don't know if it's self-imploding or what, but one of the things Christians definitely have to offer, right, as the Bible presents, is that, yes, we're here on purpose, right? There's some teleology in the universe. There wasn't just randomness and meaninglessness. There's some purpose and meaningfulness. Maybe evolution is part of the biological history of the universe. Maybe not. But regardless of that, we have a lot to offer in terms of, okay, so maybe you evolved, but the question of whether or not your life has meaning is a separate question, and one that Christians can offer a lot on, I think. Yeah.
And it is not a self-efficacy, like you said. It is very separate from it. It's important to study and understand it, but it's not related to our salvation.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I used to be bothered a lot more about the tension between faith and science. As I've gotten older, I've come to accept it more. Just that realizing that our life is finite and we're never going to know all of the answers while we're here on Earth. But the thing that I think it's important to understand the role that each play, because I think they do. I think it's important to understand as an engineer or scientist, right? I think it's important to understand what the mechanisms are, how things work. That's fascinating. But I also think it's important to understand what motivates people, what causes them to do things.
Yeah.
And if you look, take a step back and just take a look at what motivates people within society to do certain things. And I think what people believe has an impact on what they do. And I think it's very important. I think there's a safeguard in society to have accountability provides a safeguard in society. And I think that's where the importance of faith comes in. I think people who hold themselves accountable to a higher power act differently in general. And you can find there's distributions and everything like think that's very important to have that safeguard, because if you throw all of that away and focus only on what's natural, it numbs to a very bad path. And there are historical evidence of that as well.
Yeah. Is it Peter Singer? Am I getting that name right? I'll have to look up the name. But there's a philosopher named, I think his name is Peter Singer. Yeah. I love and hate that guy because I think he's finally honest about where naturalism and nihilism really lead. Mm-hmm. And that he makes the argument that infanticide should be absolutely acceptable. Because we're all just carbon atoms arranged specially to produce new carbon atoms in the next generation, but there's no actual moral reality. So what's wrong with disrupting a couple carbon atoms here and there? There's no real, meaningfully, morally wrong thing going on there. And I appreciate that he's willing to say that, because I think when you present that to an atheist, they go, well, no, it'd still be wrong because there's no good reason for it to be wrong, I think. And I think that's a major shortcoming of atheist philosophy. So I appreciate that he's willing to go there. But at the same time, yeah, how terrifying is that? That if you really delete metaphysical meaning of any kind from the universe, you end up with a terrifyingly chaotic and, I would argue, evil place. Thanks for sticking around for that very unusual episode of All Truth is God's Truth. I really appreciate that you stuck it through the whole time. As I said before, this episode will be uploaded to our new website at atigtpodcast.com. So feel free to check it out there, as well as some of the graphics that I was commenting on throughout the episode. Feel free to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/atigtpodcast, where we really will start hopefully ramping up our posting both about new episodes and some additional background content. We'd also really appreciate it if you shared this with a friend if you found it interesting and thought they might too. One way or another, we appreciate your support and we hope you'll join us again next week. Bye.